It's funny how you wake up one day and you realize that you're the person who's saying, "Oh, I was doing this 10 years ago or 15 years ago I did this," and you're not talking about necessarily a time from your childhood. You're talking about another phase in your adult life. I'm in my mid-30s now, and as I was preparing to do this video and thinking about the jumping off point, I realized, holy crap, this was 17 years ago, this particular event that I'm going to discuss in the context of the book that we're sharing this week. It's called How the States Got Their Shapes by Mark Stein. Steen, I'm not sure. There are two Mark Steins or Steens, different spellings, in the American lexicon of public figures. One of them is an oft-times radio host, and the other one is apparently a playwright and a screenwriter who wrote this book. But one of the other reasons that I mention the passage of time is to kind of help give you some perspective on just how much the United States of America has changed in the last 245 years, as we're coming up on since the Declaration of Independence. We are still a very young country, and especially in terms of world superpowers, we are an extremely young country. And I think we forget just how prone our country has been to change, every few decades. And that's a lot of what's covered in this book. So I can't remember how it was referred to me or how I came across it, but I checked it out. Was it 2019 or was it last year? Maybe it was last year. But I checked it out, and it was great. It's one of those books that works really well as a reference. It's not the kind of thing that you would just sit down and read cover to cover, because it can get kind of dry, and it can also seem sort of scatterbrained because it tends to cover the same events over and over again. It goes through all 50 states and gives you an analysis of them, in an alphabetical order. So if you're talking about Western states at the beginning of the book, with California, and then later you get into Nevada, and then you get into Utah. Those are, three neighboring states, but you're going to be talking about the same events over and over again. But back to the jumping off point for this story. When I was 19 and I was living in Spain, I was on a mission for my church. We met a lot of people from different countries. In fact, I kept track of it at one point, and I think the final tally came up to over 70 different countries. You had Eastern Europeans, Western Africans, South Americans, just people were from everywhere. Some were on vacation, others were there to work. And anyway, I had a friend who was literally from Transylvania. His name was Ionuț. He was Romanian. And while I was there, we did English classes once a week, just as kind of a public service. People were multilingual over in Europe a lot more often than you find here in the States, just because, the entirety of the European continent could probably fit inside the borders of the United States. But imagine if every state spoke a distinct language and had its own culture. You would just, kind of by default, you would start picking up other languages. But Ionuț, in addition to knowing Romanian and learning Spanish, was very good at English, and he'd learned it from watching movies and watching Cartoon Network. When he told me about the Cartoon Network bit, I asked him about some of my favorite cartoons, and he could do the Johnny Bravo voice, he could do the whole nine. Well, anyway, one night during the English classes, we had this segment where we would only speak English. They had to figure out how to ask certain questions and stuff, and so they were asking about, we were all sharing, a little bit about the history of the countries that we were from. And Ionuț asked me, he goes, I've seen a map of the United States, and why is it that all of the states on the east side have small borders that are squiggly lines, but all of the states on the west side are big with straight lines for the borders? And I gave him the general breakdown of it, that you had the 13 original colonies that were more determined by physical landmarks, rivers, mountain ranges. And then later, as the country expanded and bought much larger tracts of land, sometimes from the natives, sometimes from other, European superpowers, they would develop a formula for breaking them up to be a certain size. And so we ended up with 50 of them, but they are not all uniform in size. And this book breaks down the how and why of how it all happened. The reason I mentioned earlier California, Nevada, and Utah is because those are all states where I have lived. I grew up most of the time, or most of my life, in Nevada. I was born in California. I've spent time off and on in Utah. So out of curiosity, those were the first ones that I looked up when I read it. And those states were, well, California was more influenced by the natural resources that were found within its borders, especially gold. And it was admitted to the Union kind of as, what's the right word that I'm looking for? As a means to prevent people from moving there and breaking off and starting their own country, which is kind of funny if you consider how the United States got started. It was so rich in resources and farmland and all that stuff that the feds were like, we need to make sure that California becomes a state so we can at least exert some influence on it. Because if not, and they break off and they become their own country, we're going to have a hard time accessing the western seaboard, through the bays and the ports and stuff that are there, and we'll basically have a power between us and the Pacific, and we don't want that. Nevada, though, was more influenced by the formula that Congress had determined to break up states into individual sizes. If you were to look at a map, look at the latitude degrees and the longitude degrees, they basically had like I want to say it was 3 and 4, 3 degrees latitude, 4 degrees longitude. I could be wrong. It came up a couple of different times, but the reason that I'm forgetting the specific number is because of how each state was then changed based on what was found, again, within its borders. The Utah territory was originally much larger than the borders of Utah State right now. And it got whittled down for a couple of reasons. In the mid-1800s, when Brigham Young and the other early Mormon pioneers moved from Illinois over to the Utah Territory, the government had a fear that they were going to break off and become their own country and become too powerful. So they, again, exerted that kind of federal influence to limit the reach that those Mormon pioneers could have as they settled Salt Lake and built up and suddenly started becoming powerful within a matter of decades. Very resourceful, very industrious people. When the Comstock lode was discovered, it was originally within the borders of the state of Utah, but the feds wanted to kind of cut off those ding-dang Mormons from all that silver, and so they modified the borders of Nevada. Nevada was smaller, Utah was bigger, and now that line has changed. It's just a line on a map, and it runs right through Wendover as far as the northern parts of those states are concerned. But if you drive out there, there's really no difference in the topography between western Utah and eastern Nevada. That line is there for political purposes. I remember as a kid learning the difference between a physical map and a political map, and sometimes the lines on both of them were the same. Again, I refer you to bodies of water on the East Coast and how that influenced the borders of different states. And other times, it was there as a purely arbitrary thing. The same thing can be said of the northern border of the United States with Canada. It's that 54th parallel, 5440 or fight, I think was the slogan that kind of brought Oregon and Washington State into creation. Anyway, I'm kind of getting out into the weeds, but one of the final things that I wanted to touch on was, again, me talking about I'm 36 years old, 17 years ago I was explaining this to somebody. I got to looking at the list of states and how they all came to be, how we got 50, how we got that nice, pretty uniform United States flag. And I realized that we haven't admitted any new states to the Union since 1959. That was the year that both of my parents were born. My mom is 62 years old. That is about a quarter of the life of this country. So, having the same borders for, 25% of the time it seems like a pretty significant chunk, but I would wager that those lines are again going to change, and it will be more for political reasons than for physical ones, especially after reading this book and seeing all the different forces that influence the shapes of the states that we have right now. Utah was going to be one of those square states like Wyoming and Colorado, but we've got something physical up in the northeastern corner of the state. We've got the Uinta Mountains that are full of copper, but they are much more accessible from the eastern side of that range. And so when the lines were drawn, the feds decided, well, we'll give that to Wyoming instead. They'll be able to mine that. And what else does Wyoming have? Wind and farmland. You know, there's a reason that there's a lot more people in Utah than there are in Wyoming, and that's mainly because of resources. Again, we see the politics kind of following the physical side of things when it really, really has to. But, you know, the population of our country now is 330 million people. Most of that concentrated in dense urban areas. You can probably name them off the top of your head: West Coast, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Las Vegas. As you move into the west, Las Vegas, Salt Lake City, Phoenix. You know, all these dense places that are kind of the seats of power for political purposes for each state. It would not shock me if within my lifetime we see the map redrawn again. I would not be surprised if they combined North and South Dakota, North and South Carolina, and classic and diet Virginia, regular Virginia and West Virginia. I don't know what you would call regular Virginia, but you know, you combine those two, you instantly free up 3 stars on the map. Cut California in 2, cut probably, I don't know, Texas in 2. Really wouldn't mind if we broke up New York just a little bit, you know, take some of these little tiny states like Rhode Island and Delaware and maybe expand them and shrink it elsewhere to kind of change the layout of it. Again, it would become arbitrary, or it is arbitrary, but it would change the way that you kind of look at your birth certificate if you end up, you know, oh yeah, I was born in this state that doesn't exist anymore. Dude, how many Europeans were born in the USSR or East Germany? Those countries don't exist anymore. It's a subject of some fascination for me, and it kind of helps to anchor me in where we are right now in time. You know, knowing that it has changed before and it will change again. And reading Mr. Stein's book will give you some perspective on how. So, highly recommend that. Check out how the states got their shapes. Look up the state where you were born. Look up the state where you live now. And see how it got that way if you don't know all the interesting details. He does give you some maps and stuff to look at, and he'll break it down based on its north, south, east, west borders. Even the island states like Hawaii, he talks about how it's more than just the 6 or 7 islands that form the main cluster. The actual border of the state goes about 1,000 miles, even farther than that. But those are, you know, atolls and submerged reefs and islands that are not always accessible to man, but those rock formations and the resources on them, more importantly, belong to Hawaii. Hawaii kind of folded into the United States through corporatism and aggressive expansion and annexation. I worked with a guy several years ago who I guess you would call him a Hawaiian nationalist. He had liberate Hawaii, defend Hawaii. He had these stickers all over his truck, and he wasn't super obnoxious and up in your face about it, but he talked about it, and I found it really informative to talk to him. He goes, we were at it against our will. The ethnic Hawaiians were, in his words, not mine, betrayed by a queen back in the late 1800s, and then an American was installed who just happened to be the co-owner or co-founder of the Dole pineapple plantation, and there you go. To make a comparison to that in our day, take a look at the expanse and the reach of big tech and the influence that they have in government, or more important, perhaps, the power that they have to ignore the government. That's a good parallel between what happened then and what's happening now. So again, highly recommend this book. Check it out, and if you wouldn't mind, give this video a like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more great book recommendations. See you guys next time.